Hi, it's episode 129 of your favorite daily podcast, A Couple of Things, a podcast about things. Today, I'm going to be answering a listener question about whether you should start a podcast or not. Let's go. So, after yesterday's cry for help, I put the link to submit questions in the show notes. And you guys, I got 4 questions, like literally within a couple of minutes. And 2 people have submitted their topics for consideration to be featured on the podcast. So I'm very excited. Today, we're going to look at a question from Jadesola, and she, I assume, asks, should I start a podcast, or what things do I need to know before starting a podcast? And honestly, my immediate reaction was no, because I'm doing a daily podcast. I am so exhausted. But actually, you should start a podcast if you want to. So I'm always all for people speaking on the internet in whatever way, without sharing your thoughts or having conversations with people, whether through a podcast, writing, a blog, social media, whatever floats your boat, whatever you like to do. I'm really down for that. But a podcast is a lot. And so things that I think that you should consider before starting a podcast is, do you really want to do a podcast? Because it's not the same as writing. Like, you write. Writing is a process and everything, but it's just you and your writing. But when it comes to a podcast, there's so many things to think about depending on what you want to do. Although, if you want to keep it really simple, like my own whole quote unquote stack or process is very simple. Before Spotify decided to get rid of all the Anchor editing and recording functionality, it was simply me just opening my phone, opening the Anchor app or the Spotify for Podcasters app, and just talking into it, put the music that was already in Spotify and publish. It was really quick and easy. And then they took that away, and now I have a more somewhat complicated quote unquote stack. I don't know why I don't like that word, but I have a more complicated stack, but nothing as complicated as what many people do out there. Mine is just simply, I use Acast for hosting and publishing, and then Acast has an integration with Podcastle, which is where I record, and then I had to find my intro and outro sound. I had to do new stuff with that. So, but that's all secondary really to deciding whether you want to do a podcast or not. Before we go on, subscribe if you haven't. Okay, let's continue. So what should you actually for real think about or consider before starting a podcast? You need to know what you want to do, what you want your podcast to be about. There's no like hard and fast rules, I don't think. And my philosophy with like everything you want to publish on the internet is like, don't overthink it. If you have a thought, if you have an idea, I mean, like, refine it. Don't just be like rambling or whatever, but don't overthink what you actually want to share. So you need to decide, am I doing a podcast about work or career, or is it about me and my thoughts, or is it about being an adult, or is it about a particular career path? Is it a UX podcast, or a product management podcast, or a podcast about the tech industry? You need to just figure out what exactly you want your podcast to be about. I decided that my podcast was about me. It's literally a personal blog, but as a podcast. So you need to think about that definitely as the first step. Or you want to also think about, are you doing it by yourself, or do you want to do like co-host with a friend where you guys talk about stuff? Like, there are many podcasts like that. You need to think about, are you going to be interviewing people? Do you want to do a thing where you're interviewing people, like Lenny's podcast, or a blend of both? Because I said what I said is mostly Jola and FK talking, but then they also have episodes where they have guests on it as well. So you need to just consider, what do I want my podcast to be primarily about? It doesn't mean you won't talk about things outside of your core focus, but you have an idea of what you want your podcast to start with or focus on. So once you decide what you want your podcast to focus on, you then need to think about what cadence you want to have it on. Do you want to do it daily? Do you want to do it weekly? Do you want to do it fortnightly? Do you want to do it monthly? I would say monthly should be like the max that you go for. Because if there's too much time in between your episodes, people might not really be engaged. Daily is a lot, is intense. I don't plan to do this podcast daily forever. It's just for this 1 year. It was a challenge to myself to do something that I hadn't done before. and stretch myself, basically, which has really been very stretching. So you think about what is the goal of doing your podcast as well. Like, is it something you want to just do for fun, or is it something you're thinking of as like a professional path, or so to say, or like as a creator, or to make money, or are you using it as a lead magnet, quote unquote? So like maybe you're a freelancer and you're using your podcast as a way to get people to know about what you do so that they can find you and contact you for work, or are you using it to drive people towards like other resources that you have for sale, like maybe books, ebooks, courses, whatever. So you need to figure out like, what do I actually want this podcast to be? Or is it just a way of me just sharing my thoughts on the internet, talking about things? Is it a way for me to get visibility in the industry, in my work? Whatever your purposes are, you need to also define that, because that also gets you through the tough times. So I guess that's actually the first thing you should start with: why you want to do the podcast, then what you want to do, whether you want to do it by yourself, with your friends, what topics you want to cover, and so on and so forth. Because depending on what your goal is, that is what to now help you inform, like, oh, should I do it in this style, Q&A, interviewing me and my friend, or me and somebody who is in the industry that I want to do something with? Is it a limited series or limited edition podcast where it's like, oh, we're going to interview people in a specific industry or specific space or whatever for a limited period of time, and that's just it? Or is it going to be something that is continuous? So when you know why, then you know what format is most appropriate for it, and what frequency as well, if you're going to be doing daily, weekly, fortnightly, or monthly. Then I think once you have your why and your what and your who defined, then you also think about like your audience. I didn't think about all these things, let me know, like like all these things were not in. The only thing I thought of was, I knew that I wanted to do a daily podcast because I wanted to challenge myself. It's not something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, but I also knew that I'm not really like trying to draw an audience, so to say. Like, there's no bigger goal to this than me just extending myself or stretching myself to try something new and do something consistently. So I don't have like, oh, this is the audience I'm trying to reach. I'm just talking in a mic. Before, not, I didn't even have a mic before. I'm just talking and seeing how that goes. So if you have different goals, then you need to consider that, and that will go into thinking about your audience as well. So if what I said earlier about you're trying to make this like a lead source for whether your freelancing services, your business, or resources that you're trying to sell, then you need to think about your audience. Like, who are those people? What kinds of things do they want to hear about? What kinds of things are they looking for? And then that goes into what kind of content you put in your podcast. And if it's just a thing that you're doing for fun, or you're doing with your friends, then maybe you don't need to think so much about that. But it always helps to kind of have a content plan. Even though, like I said, I didn't like have any grand plans for this, I kind of knew already the things I wanted to talk about, especially in the beginning episodes, because I have written a lot of things on the internet, and so I had that kind of baseline. Because again, it's a personal blog, it's about what I think, so it's not like limited in scope to a specific field. It's just what I want to talk about. And I've done episodes about UX and products, which is the work that I do. I've done some career and mentorship and coaching related episodes, which is also something I do. I've talked about life, friendships, relationships, all kinds of things, just what I find to be interesting. So I think, to wrap it up, things like tools, where should I host my podcast, what tool should I use to record, all those things don't really matter, I don't think. Just do some Googles. I've already talked about the tools that I've used and I'm currently using, and do some Googles if you're really looking about tools. But I think in general, to wrap up everything, if you're looking to do a podcast, definitely I encourage you to do it. It's a lot of work, definitely a lot of work, but if you know why you want to do it, and then you can define who you want to talk to, or like in terms of who you want to listen to the podcast, or in terms of who you want to interview on the podcast, if that's what you want to do, then you can, once you define your why, you can know your who, your what, your where, your when, and so on and so forth. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Bye. Thank you for listening to today's episode of A Couple of Things. If there was anything you found interesting or insightful, or you enjoyed the episode, please do share to someone or multiple people. Like, leave a comment, and definitely do subscribe and all the nice things. Bye. Here is your regular reminder that I am accepting questions and topic suggestions. Also, you can now nominate yourself or someone else to be featured on the podcast to talk about anything that you find interesting. And you can do all of this, whether submitting a question or nominating yourself or someone, through the link in the show notes.